Hello again. We're back for part 3 of today's scheduled series of events. Before we get into our next guest, I'd just like to once again issue our thanks to our co-organizers, which is the Free Market Roadshow and the Romanian American University in Bucharest. Thank you guys so much as well. Thank you to our local partners, our international partners for making this event possible. Now we're going to go to Professor Hannes Gissurarson. He's a professor at the University of Iceland with a doctorate from the University of Oxford on F.A. Hayek's political theory. He's written more than 15 books in Icelandic, English, and Swedish. And today he's going to talk to us a little bit about politics in the time of a pandemic. Professor Gissurarson, this is over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you. And this day actually has a special significance for me because this is my intellectual mentor Hayek's birthday, 8th of May. And here I am. I have prepared a slide that I hope you can see, yes, where I am at Oxford with him and two of my friends there. We formed the Hayek Society at Oxford for discussing and debating classical liberal ideas, and the other one who was standing there, Chandran Kukhat, he also did a doctoral dissertation about Hayek. Now, what is it, since it's his birthday, that makes Hayek significant for us today? I think that it is his great question. How can we explain the enormous achievements of Western civilization despite our inevitable individual ignorance? And his theory, his solution was that the reason we can do this is that we are utilizing knowledge that we do not possess ourselves. We are utilizing skills of other people, the knowledge how, and we are also utilizing information that is made available. It's knowledge that. So we have knowledge how and knowledge that. So in a free society, coordination without commands is possible. It is a division of knowledge. And this division of knowledge applies to economists and epidemiologists alike. Epidemiologists, they know little about the economy, and economists know little about epidemics. And that's highly relevant for us today in the midst of the pandemic. So we can't hand over power to the epidemiologists. They can't take over. Neither could, in my opinion, or Hayek's as well, engineers, climatologists, or other specialists. They all possess only a little bit of the knowledge that we have to utilize, and we have to take their narrow knowledge and widen it out, so to speak. Today, the 8th of May, is also Peace Day in Europe because on the 8th of May, 1945, peace came to Europe with the Germans surrendering. And it's in a way significant also because we have seen this pandemic and hopefully it's about to end, at least here in Iceland, where I am speaking from. But what I would like to do here as a political philosopher is to discuss a little bit the state and what the state should do and can do. Now, the traditional liberal view of the state is that it should protect us against forces of the dark, the night watchman state. And you can see the Night Watch by Rembrandt, the famous painting. So the state is there to protect us against intruders and invaders, the forces of the dark, the forces that come at night. It should run the police, the military forces, and the justice system. And then the question arises, are there any further duties that the state should have? And I would say actually that possibly it has, but not as a matter of justice, but more as a matter of expediency. For example, education, we want to live in a peaceful society, which is running smoothly, and therefore we provide for the primary education of everybody. And we don't want people to die of hunger, so we provide poverty relief, because otherwise we might endanger peace and property. So it's a part of our protection of property and our prevention of injustice to provide for education and for poverty relief. These are preventive measures. And one thing that is common to all classical liberals is our suspicion, skepticism about the state, about government. Hegel is wrong when he said that the state was the march of God through history. In fact, if we look at the record of the state, it's more like the march of the devil through history. And you can see the famous painting by Goya about French soldiers killing rebels in Spain. The history of the state has been a history, unfortunately, of aggression, theft, cruelty, misdeeds, callousness. Indeed, Nietzsche may be right when he says that the state is a cold monster. Well, Hegel and Nietzsche, they may be too dramatic for most of us, but on a slightly more moderate or lower note, the public choice theorists like James Buchanan and others, they point out that the state is not likely to produce intended results because of lack of information and lack of incentives. The bureaucrats, they possess usually neither the information nor do they have the incentives to do what we expect of them. Therefore, classical liberals, they are suspicious of the state. They don't trust the state. And I think that the trust is well-founded. That lack of trust is well-founded. Then we come to a brief discussion, which is relevant to our topic today, of injustice and misfortune. The state should prevent injustice. It should protect us against intruders and invaders. But it really cannot prevent individual misfortune. Some are born less healthy or less intelligent than others. Some receive care and encouragement and others not. Some are lucky and others are not. And then there are, of course, people who are lazy, negligent, profligate, and so on. And I think that a classical liberal would say that they should bear the costs of their vices and mistakes themselves and not pass the bill on to others. And those who are more lucky cannot be expected to bear the costs of other people's misfortune. It's not their fault. It's basically nobody's fault. So that's how classical liberals would typically see the relationship between injustice and misfortune. But there is not only individual misfortune, there is also collective misfortune. And there, actually, the state may have to enter. Because despite all our suspicion of the state, despite all the faults of the state, it cannot be denied that the state is an expression of collective solidarity and the guardian of shared identity. And collective misfortunes, such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, avalanches of mud or snow, all of this quite common in my little country, Iceland, tsunamis and epidemics are usually nobody's fault. I will actually qualify that comment a little bit later about epidemics not being anyone's fault. But the main point is this: such collective misfortunes on an enormous scale, they potentially hit all. They are like an invasion into a country. They are like the invasion against which the night watchman is supposed to protect us. So if we have such a collective misfortune, we are basically in a situation somewhat akin to being in a city under siege or in a lifeboat. So I think that most sensible people would agree that the state should try to minimize and mitigate the impact of collective misfortunes. And this, fortunately, is actually easier with epidemics than with natural disasters, because natural disasters just happen, irrespective of what we do. We can only try to do something about it once they have occurred. But epidemics are different because we can try to contain and control epidemics. We do not only have to react to them, we can try to stop them. And I think most people, or almost everybody, would agree that it would be justifiable to limit the freedom of people to carry diseases to other people. So to isolate those who are infected is, of course, a limitation on their freedom, but it is a justified limitation. And then we come to the question about whether we are entitled to collect taxes in order to mitigate the effects of disasters like an epidemic or a pandemic like this one is. And I would call on two prominent conservative liberals, as I call them, David Hume and St. Thomas Aquinas, about it. St. Thomas Aquinas discusses the property rights in his Summa Theologica, and he defends property rights. He's one of the great defenders of property rights, but he also believes that they cease to apply in emergencies like in a city and the siege, because then we may have to do things that we wouldn't normally be able to do in order to save the city. And Hume concurred. He agreed with St. Thomas about this and uses actually the same example. So I would say with them, with St. Thomas and David Hume, that it is justifiable to use taxpayers' money to mitigate disasters, whether natural, like earthquakes, or social, like epidemics. But we have to bring this pandemic that we are now facing into perspective. Sometimes our attention is focused on the wrong things. We notice if a man bites a dog, but we don't notice if a dog bites a man, because that's something that's not extraordinary. And actually, if we look at this pandemic and compare it to other infectious diseases, then we see all kinds of interesting things. As I'm now speaking to you, there are about 3.6 million that have been infected with the COVID-19 virus, and there have been about 250,000 people that have died, passed away as a result of the epidemic. Now, tuberculosis is, there is 1.5 million people that die each year, and 10 million people are infected. And AIDS claims the lives each year of 770,000 people. And malaria, the lives of 405,000 people. Hepatitis C, 400,000 people. So we see that the pandemic is not really as big compared to other diseases as we may have thought, because we have concentrated so much on it. I'm not trying to belittle it. It is a very serious thing, and it really requires our action. But it is in a perspective not terribly much more than the infectious diseases that we are already battling, especially in the poor countries of the South. And I needn't remind you that the Black Death killed apparently half the world's population in 1347 to 1351. And the Spanish flu, 102 years ago, killed about 50 million people. So we have to put all this in perspective. This is not the greatest disaster that has happened to mankind, although it is serious. I would actually like to make a little digression here, because I mentioned that more than 400,000 people die of malaria each year. And why is that? If we just look at it, it is rather strange, because in the 1960s, we had almost eliminated malaria in the world. Malaria is caused by mosquitoes, and we could use against those mosquitoes DDT. It was an efficient and cheap insecticide. Well, it was probably overused in agriculture, as Rachel Carson argued in her book Silent Spring. But once this overuse is stopped, it's totally harmless to men and almost harmless to animals. So what happened was that the radical environmentalists They had the DDT banned in 1973. And as a result, malaria has increased to this level that we see today, with more than 400,000 people dying every year, and hitting especially hard the most vulnerable, the poor children in the south. I said that this pandemic may not be anyone's fault, no more than natural disasters are. But is that really true? Don't we have to qualify that statement? If China had reacted immediately and closed the borders, there would have been no pandemic. There would have been just a local epidemic. And there are all kinds of questions that remain unanswered by the Chinese authorities. Why did they ignore persistent warnings against bat-borne infections? What was really going on in Wuhan prior to the outbreak of the epidemic? Was it traced to a laboratory or to a wet market? Why are the Chinese authorities trying to suppress all information about the epidemic? Why don't they share any information? Where are all the critics that have disappeared without trace? And there was this public spokesman that was trying to spread all kinds of false rumors, talking about American soldiers having brought the epidemic to China and so on. Totally absurd notions. Why is he still doing his job as an official spokesman for the Chinese authorities? And then all the statistics from China are quite suspicious. Just the fact that they say that no soldier in the People's Liberation Army has been infected, it can't be. That's not how things happen in the world. These figures are obviously wrong. I think actually that if we look at the pandemic, we see a government failure, a colossal government failure. So the pandemic really is yet another argument against the state. There was the suppression of danger signals, and there was the slow reaction of the Chinese authorities. And another argument against the state and against economic interventionism is that the reaction in the West has been slower than it should be because regulatory agencies, they slow down the process of reacting. For example, the test of drugs. It is private enterprise that is providing the equipment that's necessary and the medicine and so on. But nevertheless, even if I would argue that those things provide an argument against the state, a case strengthens the case against the state, or at least against economic interventionism, we find in an emergency like this, like in war, that there is a strengthening of collective solidarity and a temporary sympathy for the state. We begin to think of the state not as them, as it usually is, but as us, because we are all in this together. And therefore some philosophers have spoken about such solidarity as the moral equivalent of war. But what I would like to argue is that even if we find ourselves in a lifeboat or in a city under siege temporarily, the rules there are not appropriate on a ship sailing freely in the seven seas. So we have to move from the lifeboat model to the ship model. And what we basically have had during the last 2 months is we have had socialism. Socialism has been tried and found wanting in the last 2 months. What we experienced in the West is a life like it was under socialism. A society of empty streets, where everybody stays at home, where no restaurants are open, where people have no fun, where the shops only offer us bare necessities. We have seen basically not the dictatorship of the proletariat or its spokesmen, but rather the dictatorship of epidemiologists in the West. I am here now in Iceland, and perhaps I should say a few words about the Icelandic model in the campaign against the pandemic. Generally speaking, I have the feeling that there has been an overreaction in the world. Not so much in Sweden and Iceland, but in most other countries, with this very strict lockdown of everything. It has been forgotten because the epidemiologists, they have basically ruled, they've set the agenda that economic growth is the most efficient doctor of mankind. And it's quite possible that more lives will be lost as a result of a sharp global recession than because of the pandemic, especially in less developed countries. We see this very well when we look at the figures that I quoted in the beginning of my talk about malaria, tuberculosis, and hepatitis C. They are not really common in the West, but they are common in the poor South. It seems to me, although I don't claim to be a specialist, that the Icelandic reaction to the pandemic has been moderate and sensible. What the Icelandic authorities did was to close universities and restaurants and cancel mass meetings and concerts and so on, and ban gatherings of more than 20 people. But shops were kept open, schools also, most schools, factories and businesses. And what the Icelanders did was to test as many as possible and isolate the infected and provide ventilators for those who needed them. So the approach was to isolate the problem and solve it only for those for whom it was a problem, instead of imposing the problem upon everybody, which is basically the era of a total lockdown of a society. You have to lock down those who are affected, those who are infected, but you do not have to close down everything else. You have to isolate the problem. Here you can see actually how the number of infected have gone down. That is the blue line, and the number of people cured, which is the orange line. So you can see the successful of the Icelandic approach. And in fact, today they said that nobody had been tested infected today. So that's extremely good news. But then one can wonder, though, whether we have been too successful in eliminating the virus here, because there are so few people infected in Iceland that we may be vulnerable if people come to Iceland, and then it may actually be transmitted at a very rapid rate. So even a success may breed a failure in a dialectical way. And finally, what I would like to say is this: we face some challenges. What we have seen in the last 3 or 4 or 5 months is that government blunders, especially in China, turned a local Chinese epidemic into a global pandemic. And it teaches us a lesson. We cannot be dependent on China for medicine, equipment, or information. And in the West, government overregulation has delayed responses to the pandemic. And while I accept that the government has to spend money in minimizing and mitigating the disaster, the approach has to be focused and reasonable. And I don't think it has been so in all countries. Even I think Iceland and Sweden have actually reacted rather sensibly. And the only way out of the depression that's coming is economic growth. And we can only sustain economic growth in the long run by tax cuts and deregulation, by liberalizing the economy. We do not solve the problem by throwing money at it. And these 2 or 3 months of total lockdown in the West are really 2 or 3 months of a socialist experiment that has taught us a lesson. Therefore, I say we should really try to enjoy life. We should try to breathe freely. We have to get out of the lifeboat. We have to lift the seats. Because a country should not be a fortress or a prison, it should be a home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think we do have time for one quick question, if you'd be so kind as to take a question.
Sure.
We have one from one of our readers, Mircea. He's asking, can we say that the outcome of this pandemic is more of a management problem than a medical one?
Well, I think actually it is both. And we actually have now, over the span of 12 years, experienced two wake-up calls. First, the financial crisis, and then now this pandemic. And what essential is not to enter into a blame game, but rather to try to learn from both of these, and so that they don't repeat themselves. And and the crucial thing, I would say, is to facilitate the share of information around the world. One reason why it became such a pandemic was that we didn't realize what was going on because information was hidden from us. And this actually is yet another argument for a free society, that in a free society you have much more flexibility, a much quicker reaction to problems than you have in a dictatorship because information is not suppressed.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. I wish we had more time. This was a very, very interesting presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time. We'll stop it at that for now, and we'll be back at 5 with the last of the English sessions booked for today. Thank you so much again, Professor. It was a pleasure having you today.